Okay, so I'm going to do a little something different today. I've come across some old books, and those who know me, I love old books. And this book is written in the 1700s by an Anglican minister by the name of William Wall. William Wall, he was I've got a note on here. He was a theologian, and it says here he died in 1728. He's a British priest in the Church of England. He wrote extensively on the doctrine of infant baptism. I got those books too. And not because I'm necessarily all that interested in infant baptism versus not having infant baptism. Personally, I believe that a dedication for every child in Messiah should be performed by a minister who is properly ordained with the laying on of hands, with the line of priestly authority. But it says he's generally an apologist for the English church and sought to maintain peace between it and the Anabaptists. Okay, so if you know your history, the Anabaptists were basically, they were like separatists. Now, they had been greatly persecuted by the Catholic Church in England, and they were afforded a certain amount of liberty in England because, after all, England became somewhat adverse to the Catholic Church. If you know your history, English history, the Bloody Mary, she was the one that the Catholics favored, but Elizabeth instead ascended to the throne, and this all came out of a lot of political intrigue that was going on between kings and queens back then. So the book itself is, it dates back, between these years, 1647 to 1728, when these were written. He's got quite an extensive resume here. He went to Queen's College, Oxford in 1667, his master's in 1617. And it's interesting, there's a little note here. Look at this here. He was offered more lucrative positions, but he refused out of loyalty to his parish. Look at that. So here's a man who was not, as many pastors are today. They're involved in what the Bible calls filthy lucre. But a pastor or a priest or a minister's true wealth is the people that he has cultivated into the faith of Messiah, that he has taught about the laws of Elohim, that he has laid hands upon and have prayed for. And that's the real wealth, not silver and gold and cash, as the case may be today. But here's a man who seemed very honest, and I was just very impressed by his resume in that part. Now, his larger books come from this right here, in the form of a history of infant baptism. And notice that William Wall, admittedly, was part of the Anglican Church, and so they had a lot of the traditional viewpoints, whereas there was a conflict going on at the time in England where the Anabaptists were disputing many of those claims. And so here's this other one that he is basically writing these books as a response to David Rusin, who wrote Fundamentals Without Foundation in 1703. Now, believe it or not, you can get this tract as well for free on Google Play. But what I'm going to do is just kind of go through some of this material and just kind of see, there's a lot of gems, a lot of times, that develop out of these kinds of studies. So this is Critical Notes on the Old Testament. And notice that also in here, there's some Old English. And so I'll do my best to try to translate that for you guys, for those who don't know. So this is the Critical Notes on the Old Testament, wherein the present Hebrew text is explained and in many places amended from the ancient versions. Look at that. That's what caught my eye here. The present Hebrew text is explained and in many places amended from the ancient versions. So you know what this is talking about? This is talking about the Jews monkeying with the text, to use a Catholic term. They were monkeying with it. They were altering it. And we know that there were two great alterations that happened. The first was earlier during the Babylonian time forward. And then the next was around 200 years after Messiah and his disciples, because his disciples were using the Hebrew text to prove Yeshua as the Christ. And the Jews were upset about this, so they set to work. They got their council together and began to alter the Masoretic text. So here's an old book that recounts those alterations here. And so, and then also it says here, more particularly from that of the LXXII. Okay, and I think that LXXII, let me double check that. That is, I think that's the Latin, perhaps. Let me see, what is that? I remember that before, but I just need to. LXXII. I'm almost certain that that's the. I'm gonna have to do some research on that, guys. I should know that answer, shouldn't I? But anyway, let me go on here. Drawn up in the order, the several books were written or may most conveniently be read, to which is prefixed a large introduction adjusting the authority of the Masoretic Bible. So this is talking about the Jewish copy of the Hebrew Bible, and vindicating it from the objections of Mr. WHISTON and the author of the grounds and reasons of the chieftain of the Christian religion, So Mr. WHISTON was probably pointing out a lot of these alterations, and they see the Church of England had used the Masoretic as one of the text bases. So it'll be interesting to see what this back and forth is in here. By the late learned William Wall, a Doctor of Divinity, author of the History of Infant Baptism, now first published from his original manuscript, Volume 1. Okay, so this was published in London. You can tell this book is pretty old. So we've got details on Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1st, 2 Kings, and Job. Okay, I'm not sure. Let's see here. Arata, what that means here. Okay, so the preface. Since I have grown old, I have chosen to do what many pious clergymen have advised to be done by any Christian that has a near prospect of forsaking this world, viz. To leave off in great measure the reading of other books and to spend the remainder of his time in reading only, or at least chiefly, the Holy Scriptures themselves. And if his time be prolonged, to read the whole of them over and over. When I had done this once or twice with the English translation, I chose for variety to do the same with the Latin. That might be the Latin. That LXX probably is the Latin, I think. 4 times. Let's see. Sometimes the vulgar, sometimes Capitalios. Let me Latin vulgar. Yeah, okay, so Latin vulgar, also known as the popular or colloquial Latin, is non-literary Latin spoken from the late Roman Republic onwards. Dependent on the time, its literary counterpart was either classical Latin or either or late Latin. Okay, so and then kaftalios. Okay. Not finding too much on that. I think I've got it spelled right. C-A-F-T. But those F's and stuff. Not sure. Maybe somebody could put a note down there and do some research in this video for me. So I'm consulting with the wife occasionally. Look at that. Here's a minister that has a wife that obviously is very educated back in the 1700s. Think about that. The translation of Junius and Tremilius and that of Beza. And afterward, God Almighty lengthening the space of my life beyond expectation to read over more than once the New Testament books in their original with Mill's various lections. Now, this lections, I think it's like a little writing. It's like notes. And the books of the Old Testament and the Septuagint translation with Boffs. Now, notice all of the knowledge that these older ministers had. They had a knowledge of Latin. They had a knowledge of Greek. They had a knowledge of Hebrew. Think about that. These guys, these older guys that were back in the 1700s, when you talk about a knowledgeable person that, you know, is proficient in languages, there's very few ministers today that reach that level. Very, very few. Okay. But look at all of this that they're going over, and even his wife knows some of these languages. Okay. As for the Hebrew, I could not read. As for the Hebrew, I could not read that, for currently as is fit for one that reads a book in order to practice. Okay, so he doesn't know the Hebrew, and therefore took for granted that looks like the English and the forelaid translations do well enough, give the sense of that. I think that sense, the most material difference that is between any of the copies is that which is between the Septuagint and the Hebrew. Notice that, that's important. The most difference between any of the copies is that which is between the Septuagint, which is the Greek, and the Hebrew, or the sense of the Hebrew concluded, as I said, from the, let's see here, forfade. Let's see. Sometimes I might have to look up this old English word. Forfade, Old English. From the former, it could be just a former translations, in which the different readings, though all agreeing in the substance of the religion, yet in particular passages are so many that they have convinced every learned man that has with any diligence read them both, that either the Hebrew copy which the Septuagint translators had was different from the present Hebrew in many places. So this is the key right here. Notice this. The present Hebrew would be the later copy of the Masoretic text that the Jews had altered. They had altered it. And so the Septuagint was taken from a much, much older Hebrew text and was translated into Greek. Okay? So there's proofs there in the Septuagint that taken from an older Hebrew text, and you compare these two, and you get the idea that the new Hebrew text had been altered by the rabbis. The lying pen of the scribes, Jeremiah talks about that. Okay, in many places, many phrases, expressions, and many numberings, etc., or else that the Greek translation has suffered much by time, by the, the carelessness of scribes, copiers, etc. He's giving both sides here, has received many alterations, or that it was made in, or it was made in many books of the Old Testament inaccurately at the first. And I think in a plain case that all these three things are each in some measure true, okay? That the authors of the translation of many of the Hebrew books into the Greek, which we call the Septuagint, were but meanly skilled in the language of their own books. In other words, I think that's a compliment. Very skilled, highly, for I suppose they were all Alexandrian Jews, and more meanly in the Greek language into which they translated, and that they have rendered absurdly some even of those texts in which their Hebrew copy was the same as the present. Okay, wait a minute here. Were more meanly skilled in the language of their own books. Let me see what that, if I can find that phrase. More meanly skilled. Seems like that seems to suggest that they knew the language well, and that they have rendered absurdly some even of those texts in which their Hebrew copy was the same as the present, and that some of these authors have done their work much better than others, okay? For it is plain that most of the several books have been translated by several men at different times, among whom the translators of the Pentateuch are the eldest and the best. Look at that. Among whom the translators of the Pentateuch are the eldest and the best, to which we may add the translator of Ezekiel and the translators of the latest books, the worst, or at least they have suffered most. I think that's what that's saying. It is true also that the Greek translations have, beside their original defects, suffered much by time and by the carelessness of or over boldness of transcribers, and the readings have in several copies been severally altered since the apostles' time, as is too plain by the various readings now seen in the several editions made from the several MSS. Origen went in a little more than 100 years. Now notice these quotes, like from Origen and these church fathers. You don't get this stuff in new books. A lot of it's too, it's not politically correct or religiously correct and this is why I like these older books, because it includes these older quotes. So he's talking about Origen here, when a little more than 100 years after the apostles' time, he let about, he let about making an edition called Hexapla, which should have the Hebrew as it was then, and the Greek translations of it, which have been made by Aquila. I think Aquila probably was the one mentioned in the Bible, Theodosian and Symmachus, in the space of the said 100 years. And the old Septuagint translations, all represented in one view in collateral columns in one page, found the common copies of the Septuagint too faulty and mid-written in many places, that it cost him a great deal of pains by comparing together the best MSS, so that's like manuscripts, to make a correct copy of it. And when that was done, he was fain to make notes. He was, in other words, he didn't want to, perhaps, I think fain, that's an old English word. He was fain to make notes of the differences between that and the Hebrew. Let's see, by by alterations, perhaps. And obli, one, two, that the Hebrew had more than or different from the Greek. The other two, too few, that the Greek had more than the Hebrew. Okay, so that's few. One, too few, what the Hebrew had more than or different from the Greek. The other, too few, what the Greek had more than the Hebrew. And in 200 years after his time. So notice this here. This is, here's Origen writing this thing 100 years and all of these manuscripts, and yet there's differences. There's differences, very interesting. And in 200 years after his time, the editions of the Septuagint were so far, this looks like vitiated again. Let's try and see. Yeah, okay, vitiate. That means to vitiate. Spoil or impair the quality or efficacy of. Okay, so vitiated. I learned a new word. That Saint Hierom in his time complained that the several countries of Christendom reading their books of scripture of the Septuagint, for that was all the scripture they had of the Old Testament, none of them understanding Hebrew, with several varieties at Constantinople and in all the country between that and Antioch. And they used an edition which had been reviled by Lucian, a presbyter and martyr of Antioch, in all Palestine and the country between Antioch and Egypt, that of the Hexapla, restored by Eusebius in Alexandria and all Egypt, an edition corrected by, it looks like, Hesychius. And these have many little differences, especially in some copies of each of them. The scribes had made many blunders in spelling the names of men or places, or in numerical words or figures. So that Saint Hierom says, the Hebrew names having been first misspelt by one, were by the next written more corruptly. Till at last, instead of Hebrew names, they were become sarmatical ones. Let's look up that sarmatical. Define sarmatical. They don't even have it. It's an old English word. Yeah. Oh, maybe that one's got me. If you know what that one is, put it down in the notes. And he acknowledges to Damascus that this might be Damascus, that deprivation which had befell the Greek books was the only reason that could justify his pains in making a new Latin translation from the Hebrew. Isn't that something? So that's why I think he's talking about Eusebius made, is it one of these guys? I don't know if he mentioned Eusebius early. Yeah, Eusebius was complaining about this. He's making a new Latin translation from the Hebrew. So they dispensed with the Greek and took the Latin from the Hebrew. And ever since to our time, and in our time, the Vatican, the Alexandrian, the Alden, and the complete editions of the Septuagint have each of them some various readings peculiar to them. These two things, the imperfect skill of the first translators and the injuries of time which the translations have since suffered, have a reason too plain of many differences that must be between them and the Hebrew. and between any Latin and vulgar translations from them, and any translation made immediately from the Hebrew. But beside all this, there is reason to conclude, thirdly, I think this is like thirdly, that the Hebrew copy itself has received some alterations in so long a process of time by the same means that I said the Greek and other translations have done. Okay, look, here's where it's at. The Hebrew copy itself received some alterations in so long a process of time by the same means that I said the Greek and other translations have done. Wow. And these alterations by scribes came into it before the time of the Masorah. Look at that, the Masorah. Now, I think that's Masorah. When was the Jewish Masorah compiled? It could be the that could be the Masoretes before the time of Masoretes. Okay, so that could be referencing the first alterations that are read about another time. Since that time of the Masoretes, they have taken as good care as could be taken against any alterations to be made after that time. But as Dr. Hammond remarks, there is no security against such mid-writings or mid-pointings as might come into the copies. Oh, miswritings or mispointings. Miswritings or mispointings. So as might come into the copies before that time, some since the time of the Septuagint translations, and some perhaps before that time, ever since the time of the captivity. Okay. So even before the Masoretes, there was differences between some of these texts. Okay, so this is a thing which the generality of learned and pious Christians were for a long time very unwilling to allow to be true. Look at that. Look at that. They seem to have thought that the providence of God would interpret or have would interfere or had interfered itself in a miraculous way to prevent any faults or mistakes from coming into the copies of his word, as speaking of Almighty Word, in its original languages, whatever might happen in translations. This must have been an extraordinary miracle, and such a thing as has never verified in the case of any book, since however infallibly directed the prophets and the first writers of the books were in their writing, 'tis plain that the transcribers were ordinary men to whom no promise was ever given to preserve them from mistakes, from carelessness, and from ignorant blunders in copying and transcribing. Nor has any book in the world had many copies of it transcribed without this misfortune. And since the various lections, I think the lections would be like the notes of the books of the New Testament in its original language have been collected. Let me look that up again. Okay, it's like it's okay. I see what it is here. Like a variant reading of a text. So it's like it'd be in the notes. They have lections today in a lot of these big Bibles that include alterations in the notes. Okay, so all since the various lections in the books of the New Testament in its original language have been collected from the best MSS, it would be like the manuscripts sourcing, and found to be so many, all men do now, I think, recede from the opinion which had been conceived of the Hebrew books of the Old Testament being free from any mistakes or miswritings at all. And so I think what he's doing is he's mentioning the alterations in the Masoretic text that the Jews have today. Many of them done, as I've understood it earlier, to hide the identity of Jesus Christ or Yeshua Messiah in Hebrew, to hide him, to hide plainly that the prophecies would foretell Yeshua coming. And some learned men, let's see, Masoretic, Verfions, etc., have gone into the contrary extreme, thinking the Septuagint, version fit to be preferred before the present Hebrew. Notice that. He's implying that at least the present Hebrew is more accurate in all places where they differ. In other words, he's saying that this guy, Masoretic Verfions, basically just says, well, because there's some mistakes in the Hebrew, we're just going to go with all the Greek. And this author, Dr. Wall, is saying, no, you need to look at both of them. They each have some problems. Okay, so the middle opinion between these two is, as I can see clearly, the right. In other words, notice that I just said that. He's somewhere in the middle. He says both of them have problems. That in some texts, the context and scope of the place will convince any attentive reader that the old translation has preserved the true sense, where the present Hebrew has had by some chance the words miswritten, misspelt, or mispointed. But there are 10 times more places. Listen to that. But there are 10 times more places where the Greek translators have mistaken the sense. Oh, Dr. Snyder, look at this one. Wow. But there are 10 times more places where the Greek translators have mistaken the sense and misrendered the words or clauses, or where their books have been by length of time altered by careless scribes, so that for any one copy of the Old Testament books, the Hebrew is far more exact. Overall, it's far more exact, barring, his opinion is, barring those alterations, perhaps we could say, where they were hiding the identity of Yeshua Messiah because they were losing people, okay? Yet not so exact, but that it may in many places be corrected from the Greek. Okay, so there's some places in Greek. For example, one example I could suggest might be the difference between Alma and Parthenos. I think it's Parthenos in the Greek. But the idea is that the Greek retains the idea that it was truly a virgin girl that the Holy Spirit came upon and impregnated in such a way that it produced Yeshua the Messiah, who was sinless. But the Hebrew says, it says a maiden. It uses this term maiden. So that could be one. And in some few places of the Pentateuch from the Samaritan. Look at that. Look at that. So what is he suggesting here? He's suggesting that the Hebrew doesn't have all of it, but it has a little more than the Septuagint. And then even in this Pentateuch from the Samaritans, there are places that you can take and compare and perhaps shed some light on the differences between the Pentateuch and the Masoretic text. Wow. Since the time of the Masorah, the Hebrew has continued unaltered. Since the time of the Masoretes. So he's saying, and I think this has to do with the Masoretes. What he's saying here. I wish my phone would. They worked between the 5th and the 10th century to preserve. I think that has to do with Masoretes. So he's suggesting that they did a better job. Wow. But there is great reason to think that there was at that time, which is supposed to be about the year of Christ, 125. There was great reason to think that there were at that time, which is supposed to be about the year of Christ. Now, I'm not sure what this. Several MS copies of the Hebrew. Okay. I wonder why he says 125 here. Several MS copies of the Hebrew Bible with several various lections, and that the rabbis then met together at Tiberias, as tradition is, pitched upon one of them, which they would have to be taken for the authentic copy. Look at that. To be owned and used in all synagogues, and to avoid variety, destroyed all the rest. Oh my goodness. So that's what the Jews did at Tiberias. Or forbid the use of them, referring a few various lections. Oh, look at this, the Keri and the Ketib. Look at that, guys. Okay, so actually, the Keri and the Ketib in Hebrew means what is written. The Keri is what's spoken. Now, this has, boy, I would love to, wouldn't you love to get your hands on these here? Because you know what? This has implication for the name. And we know that Jehovah is not right. So here's another proof that what's his name that goes around this Kyrite guy. Oh, what is his name? Anyway, he's always with Michael Rood. Okay, so here's this saying here that they a lot of them they got rid of, but some of them they kept. And it says referring a few various lections, the Kari would be the Kari and the Ketib, which would be the Ketib would be what's written. So like in the name, use this name here. Okay, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. Okay, so what is spoken would be what's the Kari, which it comes from Kara, which means to call out or to speak. And Ketib comes to Katab, which means what's written. And so that the Ketib, as he calls it, I think if you look at some of the texts that are pointed, they have this, I think they got like this right here. They got like a Shabbat and they have a Holem. So they have Yahoo, and then, let's see, actually, what would that have there? Yeah, it would be like, maybe it would be like, yeah, it would be a Shabbat. And then it would be, nope, it wouldn't be a Holem. I think this, I'm going by memory on what that text says, okay? So excuse my, let's see, so let's see, yeah. Oh, and I think it's probably a superlinear Holem here. And then there is like a, what's called a reduced patak, or I think it's called a hataf patak, Yehovah. Okay, so if you look at this example, and let me see if I can call this up on. I wish I had a better keyboard on this iPhone. Okay, yeah, that's correct. And it uses comments. It uses comments. Okay, so what they do here is they put the comments under the Vav. And so this truly is a Vav. And they put the superlinear Holem here on the side of the hay. Okay, so you've got Yod, and then you have Shavah. It's Yehovah. Okay, so that's how you get Yehovah. Okay, so here's what he's saying. They destroyed all the rest or forbid the use of them, referring a few various lections to the Kari and the Kari. I think it's Kari. You usually see it spelled like this. Kari, okay? That's a transliteration. And it comes from Kara, meaning to call or speak. And then you have the Katib here. So what's written is here, okay? That's what's written, but that's not pronounced in the synagogues because it's considered too holy. But what is spoken is here, the Kiri. So when the reader comes to this word, the set apart name, they'll resort to what's spoken rather than what's written, okay? Because it's too holy to speak that name. That's kind of what's going on there. Okay, chosen. Okay, so they forbid the use of them, referring a few various lections. That's like notes. The Kiri and the Katib, chosen with not the greatest judgment. Listen to that, chosen with not the greatest judgment. Oh my gosh. Here is a 17th century minister admitting that they very well may have altered some of these, just like they did the name. So Yehovah, you guys know me. I'm of the opinion in all my years of studying these old books, it's wrong. It's not Yehovah. It's either Yahweh or Yahuwah. It's one of those. But you decide as you will. Notice that. Here's a guy, he says that they're chosen with not the greatest judgment. Much in the same way as the Bishop of Rome of late, when when there were many, okay, come on here. When there were many various lections, that's notes, got into the several copies of the vulgar Latin, established one of them, look at that, and ordered all the rest to be disused. It could be disused. So that what faults or mistakes of writing were in that one copy of the Hebrew became afterwards incurable by any other means. Okay, hold on here. So that what faults or mistakes of writing were in that one copy of the Hebrew became afterwards incurable by any other means, but only by comparing the old Greek translation. Look at that. So the Pope got himself, decided to get rid of all texts that were, not in agreement, and he just decided we're going to go with this one, which or of a chief part of which had been taken 400 years before from the Hebrew books, which in many places, let's see here, shows how the old Hebrew copy from which they translated stood in their days, in which in some places of the Pentateuch is confirmed by the Samaritan copy of the law. Okay, so you got the Pope on one side, just unilaterally deciding we're going to go with this copy, and that's what we're going to make the Latin, the Vulgate out of. And then you got the Jews at Tiberias saying, we're going to go with this one, and these other ones we're either going to burn, or we might keep them around just, and preserve some of the notes maybe in the side panel there in the page, or we'll just keep them in scrolls. And then, so the only way to resolve them, according to this guy, back in the 1600s, is to compare the Samaritan copy of the law. So if you really want to understand the Bible as you should, well, number one, to get to this guy's level, you need to know some Latin, you need to know some Greek, and you have access to those texts. And you need to understand Hebrew. Now, this guy doesn't understand Hebrew real well. He said so, but to, in other words, from a mental standpoint, ultimately, I believe that the Holy Ghost guides you in your study, guides you. But this is a lot of interesting information, and they've got 3 bodies of text: the Samaritan copy, the Pentateuch. In other words, the Pentateuch confirmed by the Samaritan copy, the Greek translation, and the Masoretic text. And this is a thing which had happened to all ancient books that have been anciently translated, that in some places where the copies of the original have been by scribes, let's see, vitiated. That means like broken down or corrupted, or by length of time, or by some chance blotted or erased. The old translation helps to restore the sense. In other words, what's really supposed to be communicated there. So Hutius found it in the copies of Origen's comment on Jeremiah, which Saint Jerome, that could be Saint Jerome, had in his time translated into Latin. Yep, that's Saint Jerome, where the Greek was faulty. Let's see, this could be Julius, actually, possibly in this transliteration. Could judge by the Latin how the Greek must have been. And so it is found in 100 instances of several books, and even in the case of the New Testament itself, in some places where the old Latin or Syriac shows in dubious readings how the Greek which they had was. Now, you know what? I'm going back to that where it says they were meanly translated. It could be that they were somewhat, I think, now I'm beginning to think and reading the context of that comment, it could be that they were not translated very well. Obviously, because he says there's 10 times more errors in the Septuagint than the Masoretic when you take the whole body of knowledge. Interesting thing here, to be meanly translated could mean that you're whacking at it. It's like you're something that requires a scalpel and you're bringing an axe to a surgery, okay, to figure out, okay, that's kind of a, let's see here. And the same thing is apparent. In the books of Chronicles, which in many parts of them being a transcript of what had been written in the books of Samuel and the Kings, and having been worse handled by transcribers than any other book of Scripture. Wow, look at that. He says Chronicles is less reliable than Samuel and Kings, yet do in some few places keep the true reading which has been lost in Samuel and Kings. Isn't that something? So it does have some places that's very similar. It had been therefore to be with that the rabbis, however, preferable. They might think that MS copy, that's manuscript copy, which they preserved to any one of the rest, had yet suffered the rest to remain. For some of them that were more imperfect in the main, yet would have had in here and there a place the true reading preserved, which was lost in the other, okay? But far from that, they got this which they took to be the authentic copy, translated into Greek in some opposition to the old translation of the Septuagint, which they themselves had hitherto owned by Aquila first. And I wonder if Aquila first, within 2 or 3 years after it had been at Tiberias established, and 40 years after again by Theodosian, and afterward by Symmachus, to the intent that the Hellenist Jews might use these new translations in their synagogues, which had fewer differences from that their established Hebrew copy than the old one had. Okay, so he's saying here, which had fewer differences from that their established Hebrew copy than the old one had, as they procured as far as they could, that the old one, as well as the old Hebrew copies, which differed anything from that which they had approved, okay, as from that which they had approved, should be diffused among their people. Okay, so he's saying here, let's see here, and afterward by Symmachus, to the extent that the Hellenist Jews might use the new translations in their synagogues, which had fewer differences. So the newer ones had fewer from that their established Hebrew copy. Okay, now that could be a bad thing. It could be a bad thing because they're just making choices here on what the translators than the old one had, and they procured it as far as they could. That the old one, as well as the old Hebrew copies, which differed anything from that which they had approved, should be diffused among their people. Okay, but the Christians of these times, both the Jewish believers and the Gentile Christians, notice this. Look at the designation here. Jewish believers and Gentile Christians. It was like you do see some of that in Acts, of each of which first there were at that time all over the world many myriads. Look at that. A lot of different, differences between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians adhered to the old translation. The Gentile Christians understood no Hebrew, and a great part of the Jewish believers living among the Gentiles used and had now for a long time used the Greek translation in their public service. Isn't that something? The Jewish believers living among the Gentiles used and had now for a long time used the Greek translation in their public service. Oh, because the Gentiles they were ministering to, many of these could not read Hebrew. Isn't that something? So in other words, these would be talking about Hellenist Jews who came into the faith of Yeshua. Nor if they could, would they have forsaken those readings which the apostles and evangelists had in their books cited. So he's a great part of the Jewish believers. Okay, so the Gentile Christians and the great part of the Jewish believers living among the Gentiles used and had now for a long time used the Greek translation in their public service. Many of these could not read Hebrew. Okay, nor if they could, would they have forsaken those readings which the apostles and evangelicals had in their books cited. Okay, so must be that immediately they translated a lot of the Hebrew text into Greek. And they began to use those because they were trying to appeal to the Gentiles. The lay people of the Jews could not help this destroying or laying aside of all the Hebrew copies, but that one, because about that time the wars under Hadrian were so severe as almost to dispeople all Palestine. Look at that. Very vicious wars. There was no time to regard books, but everyone must fly for their lives. The few that escaped fled into the several dispersions. That was during Hadrian. The Gentile Christians could not help it, nor the Hellenist Jews which believed, for they understood no Hebrew, nor had any Hebrew Bibles. Okay, Hellenist Jews had completely capitulated over to Greek culture. They had for the Old Testament only the Septuagint, and there was no communication, but a mortal hatred between them and the unbelieving Jews. Interesting. Well, that began, this conflict began all the way back to the days of Judah Maccabee. And the Maccabees went around, when they made war against Antiochus Epiphanes, his armies, they punished Jews. They punished Jews for being Hellenized. And, and so this caused a lot of animosity between Hellenized Jews and Hebrew Jews. Okay, so the believing Jews who fled to Pella. Look at that. You know what that's a reference of? That's a reference to when Jerusalem in 70 AD was surrounded by the Roman army, and so who was it? Okay, so what happened is there was a report that came out of Egypt, and so the Romans withdrew the unbelieving Jews in Jerusalem, who they were all trapped, the Christian Jews and the unbelieving Jews. And so there was a report out of Egypt that maybe there was something untoward going on in the kingdom of Rome. And so Titus, there it is, Titus, he pulled the forces back for a short space of time. Okay, and so the believing Jewish Christians, they took advantage of the fact. See, most of the unbelieving Jews, they thought, oh, well, he'll be back. We're just going to stay here. They might have gone out and foraged a little bit to get some food to last them, but which there really wasn't anything left because the Romans had completely destroyed all everything around Jerusalem. And so the believing Jews, however, have remembered a prophecy that was given to them. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee. Okay, and so they took off like mad, and they fled to Pella. Okay, well, shortly after that, Titus and all the armies came back and meted out judgment. Now, look at the picture here. The Almighty, Yeshua Messiah, the Son of Elohim, gives them an opportunity to get out of the judgment. Okay, so it's interesting. No, I don't believe that this has implication for our days. I just feel like I should go into this a little bit with you guys. I don't think that we're going to have a pre-tribulation rapture, but here's what I do think. I think that the Father will remove his people from the beast empire during the tribulation, and will protect them, just like he protected the early Christian Jews who fled Jerusalem and fled to Pella. Okay, he's gonna put them somewhere, a place of safety. He's going to do that same thing. He's not going to come and whisk them out of trouble. No, but he's going to protect them so that they go through it. And at the end of the tribulation, when Messiah, Yeshua, comes, the last trump sounds and the dead in Christ rise, and then we which remain will be caught up into the air to be with the Lord forever. Then the Lord and all of this will come down, and it'll inaugurate the Messianic kingdom, and inaugurate the Atid Labo, which is the 1,000-year reign of Messiah. Okay, so I did a little bit of a sermon there just on that one line, but if you want to see the picture of when Messiah comes down, I think that's in Zechariah. Let me find the chapter for you. Anyone who doubts? Okay, yeah, Zechariah 14. Okay, so this finishes the picture of Messiah. He comes with all the armies of heaven, and the dead in Christ rise to meet him in the air, and then we which remain will be caught up into the air to be with the Lord forever. And then notice this here. This is in Zechariah 14. I can get, behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half of the city shall go into exile. Has that ever happened before? No. When Babylon took control of Jerusalem, they razed it. They destroyed the temple, and they took all the Jews that were still alive, and they put them in slavery and displaced them. Okay, did that happen when Titus? Was only half the city taken? No, it wasn't. It was totally razed and destroyed, and the Jews were commanded upon penalty of death not to go back, except for one time a year they could stand at a great distance and lament what had happened to them in 70 AD. Okay, so this says right here, Zechariah chapter 14. Behold, the day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you be divided in your midst, for I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. That's future, my friends. That's going to happen. And now notice this, then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on the day of battle. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies between Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley. So the earth is going to open up. And so that one half of the mount shall move northward and the other half southward, and you shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azal, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. That's the rest of the picture of Thessalonians. Jesus comes down to the earth and establishes his kingdom. Notice that he's going to literally change the waters, make them purified. On that day, there shall be no light, cold, or frost. He's going to restore the earth in temperate, all over the earth. It's going to be temperate temperature. None of these extremes of super hot, super cold. There shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light. On that day, living water shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter. And the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day, the Lord will be one and his name one. Is the Lord's name one? And his name is the Lord, is the Master Yeshua. Is he physically reigning over all the earth? And is he one unified Lord and his name one? People can't even agree on what his name is today. Think about it, folks. That's my sermon. I could say more of that, but I don't want to belabor. So the Jews fled to Pella and the other eastern countries, which they used the Hebrew language and had doubtless their books in Hebrew, might be for their own Bibles had helped it. Let's see, and probably did, but to the woeful damage of Christian religion, there was not, nor for a long time had been, any more communication of the Gentile Christians with them than with the unbelieving Jews themselves. Okay, I take this breach of communion, correspondence, and communication between the Jewish Christians that fled from Jerusalem into the east and the Gentile Christians, which breach continued to the former, were totally destroyed or dissipated, to have been a great mismanagement and the greatest misfortune that ever befell the Christian church. Interesting. They fled from Jerusalem to the east, and the Gentile Christians, which breach continued till the former were totally destroyed or dissipated. Okay, so to have been a great mismanagement and the greatest misfortune that ever befell the Christian church. I think he's talking about how the Gentiles abused the Jewish Christians. Possibly, not only in respect to their books, which by comparing their copies of the Old Testament and of St. Matthew's Gospel might have been rendered more unexceptionable. In other words, he's saying might have been rendered more accurately, but in many other respects concerning the benefit and advancement of religion, St. Paul labored with all his might, aim, and study to keep up union, communion, and friendship between these bodies of Christians. You know that what this is talking about here is that right now there is a wall of division between Gentile Christians. You got all these you've got all these denominations out there. You got the Pentecostals, you got the Methodists, you got the Baptists, you got the Catholics, you got the Anglicans. But guess what? They all stem from Rome. They're Gentile Christianity. And then there's a wall of division between us. That's those who have a propensity to study the laws of Elohim and try to apply them to our lives and try to interpret the New Testament in such a way that agrees with the laws of Elohim and that we might find in Genesis to Malachi, okay? And try to find union and communion rather than this separation between the two. That would be like you would say the Hebrew, the Essene, the Messianic, the people who keep the seventh-day Sabbath, the fourth commandment, who keep, even there might be a division, say, like between using the name. Right now, the churches of Rome, whether they be Pentecostal, whether they be Baptist, whether they be Methodist, whatever they be, okay? Right now, they don't use the name of God. Why? Because it's out of respect. Some misguided idea centuries ago. So they use God, which is a title, and they use Lord, which is another title, okay? And so they don't use Yod He Vav He. They don't use that. But among the Messianics and the Jewish, more of the people like, let's say the Jewish / Messianic / Essene kind of groups, we use the name. Now, sometimes we don't agree on how the name should be pronounced. But look at that. St. Paul labored with all his might, aim, and study to keep up union and friendship between these two bodies of Christians. I'm not ashamed to be called a Christian because I'm Messianic. I'm not ashamed to believe that Paul truly was an apostle of Elohim, although I believe the Roman church corrupted many of his letters. Or perhaps not so much because of some Machiavellian plan, although that's a possibility, but because of the fact that there is so much variation in the Hebrew language, and it had to be consolidated down into this monolinear Greek language. Okay, now if you want to study more of that, study Avi Ben Mordecai's book on Galatians, and you can see how that's true. It's a powerful lesson there. So St. Paul labored with all his might, aim, and study to keep up union and communion and friendship between these two bodies of Christians, the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. And he did with great difficulty preserve it in some good degree as long as he lived. But after his death, we hear no more of any communication between them for some hundreds of years. Look at that. Epiphanius had some knowledge of those of the Jewish Christians which remained to his time. This is in AD 370, whom the Gentile Christians then called Nazarenes. Look at that. Well, the Nazarenes. And he, let's see, styles them heretics. Look at that. Well, of course, because Epiphanius was a Roman church father. He's not going to break from their dogma. He's not going to admit the fourth commandment, the seventh-day Sabbath. He's not going to admit all of the feast days that testify to Jesus Christ or Yeshua Messiah. He's not going to admit to that. They replaced their own holidays because they had such a hatred of Jews. And they had a hatred of anything that was deemed Jewish, even if it could be found all throughout Scripture, whether Old Testament or New Testament. Okay, you understand what's going on here? So here's Epiphanius. By the way, I have this book, Epiphanius, one of them anyway. I think it's like 4 volumes. Wow, there's some powerful stuff in here because it's a catalog of all the different early Christian groups. And some of the stuff on the Nazarenes is just amazing, the stuff that they preserved. Okay, so who the Christians then called Nazarenes, and he styles them heretics for no other reason that I can perceive, but that they, together with their Christian faith, continued. Look at that. This guy's pretty darn fair, isn't he, in his analysis? Continued the use of circumcision and of the Jewish law. Notice he calls it Jewish law. Actually, it's God's law. He's taken this from a perspective of an Anglican minister, understand, which is a thing that St. Paul never blamed on the Jewish Christian, though in the Gentile Christians he did. And Epiphanius, at almost the same rate, might have censured James, the Bishop of Jerusalem. Look at that. Remember how James, the book of James, It barely by a hair's breadth made it into the canon. By a hair's breadth. If there was just a few more votes, it would have never made it into the canon. Think about that. And those thousands of the Jerusalem Christians with him for heretics. This is Epiphanes accounting. In other words, we are heretics. We're heretics to the Roman church. And unless you find a very kind pastor in a denomination that's from Rome, whether it be Pentecostal, whether it be Methodist, whether it be Anglican, whether it be Presbyterian, they all stem from that mother church, Rome, in their practices and doings. Okay, unless you can find someone who's very kind to allow you to worship there, you're going to have a hard time, because that same enmity against us is still there that was here spoken about in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, of which Epiphanes in his books talks very boldly about, calling people like us, he calls them heretics. But we're not, my friends. We're not heretics. We are simply presenting another side to Christianity that Rome has discarded. Rome has discarded this. Okay? And so where do you find the truth? Where do you find the truth? Just like in the textual, okay, by comparing the Greek received text, by comparing the Masoretic text, and even the Samaritan, the Pentateuch taken from the Samaritan. 3 things, and that's the way it is with people. If you want to find the truth, the Greeks have to come together. The Gentile Christians have to come together with the Messianics. Okay, they have to come together because we all agree Yeshua Messiah, he is King, and because his crucifixion represents Christ and him crucified is the first pillar upon which our unified faith stands. Okay, so this is back to Epiphanes. He said that because these Messianics considered the use of circumcision of the Jewish law, the Nazarenes, Messianics, Essene, believers in Yeshua, which is a thing that St. Paul never blamed on the Jewish Christian, though in the Gentile Christians he did. And Epiphanes, at almost the same rate, might have censured James, the Bishop of Jerusalem, and those thousands of the Jerusalem Christians with him for heretics, concerning whom James said to Paul, let's see, this is Acts, let's see here, 21:20. Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. Of these men, copies of the Old Testament, Epiphanes says nothing. He doesn't want to give them any credit. Of St. Matthew's gospel, he says they have their entire in the Hebrew. Now notice this. This is in Epiphanes's book, Panarion, which essentially means it's like breadbasket. It's like, in other words, it's all these various sects in the breadbasket. It's kind of like Hillary Clinton when she said of anybody who voted for Trump, they're in the basket of deplorables. Okay, that's the attitude Epiphanes had for not only Nazarenes or Essene Christians or Messianic Christians or Jewish Christians. They were all in the basket of deplorables. Okay, but he does say some interesting things in his book. He admits in Panarion by Epiphanes of Salamis, he admits that they had St. Matthew in its entirety in Hebrew. Think about the implications of that. Okay, so that has implications for textual stuff. So in the same form which it was first written, look at that. He acknowledges Hebrew primacy in the book of Matthew. So how many preachers have told you, oh, the New Testament was written all in Greek? Buddy, you are wrong, and you're you're being disingenuous with your hearers. No, Matthew was written originally in Hebrew. Okay, and it may have been some other books too, written originally in Hebrew, but then were transcribed from Hebrew. to Greek, okay, for the Gentile believers. Okay, so they had their entire in Hebrew and in the same form in which it was thus written. Says that he knew not whether they left out of it the genealogy from Abraham to Christ, and of a copy of the same gospel kept by the Ebionites. This is another one in the basket of deplorables that Epiphanius rails against. A sect of Jewish Christians separate from the Nazarenes. Why were they separate? Because number one, the Nazarenes would eat meat, but only clean meat. Ebionites would not even eat meat, considered a sin as such to eat meat. There were some other differences too, some slight differences in them. He recites some of the first words by which it appears that it began where the third chapter of our copy begins and where St. Mark and St. John began, viz. At John's baptism. He lays that the copies of the Corinthians, of the Cappadocians, and of the Ebionites all agree in this. Look at this. It appears that it began where the third chapter of our copy begins and where St. Mark and St. John begin, viz. At John's baptism. He says that the copies of the Corinthians, of the Cappadocians, and the Ebionites all agree in this and that of the Nazarenes, for aught he knew. Okay, there it is, Epiphanius. It's called heretics or Panarian. It's also known that, 28, 29, and 30. A little after this, St. Jerome, I think that's St. Jerome maybe. Notice that this is Old English, guys, Old English. Let me see how long I've been going on here. I've been going on for quite a while. Okay, we're well over an hour here. Okay, so this is after this, St. Jerome, living in Palestine, grew acquainted with some Jews whom he hired to teach him the Hebrew language, and he attained to a greater skill therein than any Gentile Christian had ever had before. Okay, so what I want to look at is here. I think this is Jerome, but I could be wrong here. Yes, I think it is. Let's see, St. Jerome. Yeah. Could very well be St. Jerome, okay? Yeah, Jerome is Jerome, okay. That had ever had before. They furnished him also with a Hebrew copy of the Old Testament. Wow, look at that. Of which he made a great and excellent use. He had before published a translation of the Old Testament books out of the Septuagint into Latin, which I suppose differed but little from the old Italian version, Italica version. I wonder what that is, which had been in use ever since there had been a church of Latin Christians. For that also had been taken from the Septuagint, okay? But now he found that by the Hebrew itself, many texts might be corrected. So he used the Hebrew. Look at that. So here is William Wall, this Puritan preacher. I mean, this man is very knowledgeable. And he's saying that the Greek text, if you compare it to the Hebrew, it's got like 10 times more mistakes than the Hebrew text, but he still acknowledges the Hebrew text has problems, okay? So here's Jerome. He's taking this Hebrew text that was furnished to him, and he's making a Latin translation, and it turns out that it's got better text. Okay, let's see here. For that also had been taken to the Septuagint, but now he found that by the Hebrew itself, many texts might be corrected, not only of the Italic version. This could be the Is he trying to say Italian version of his own Latin translation? But even of the Septuagint itself, especially of any one copy of it, then extant. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a mark here. There we go. Okay, so I've got that now. Okay, so hey, if you guys enjoyed this, if there's a lot that you're getting out of this, if there's corrections or anything that's of interest, send me an email, shul@hmisrael.com. And we also have Sabbath services. You can go 11. I'll try to get that right here in a minute. 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, USA time. If you want to come to the Sabbath service, go to www.theyahad.com, and that uses Zoom. So learn how to use Zoom. And hey, put some comments down. I'm going to upload this to YouTube. And if you like this kind of stuff, I just love this kind of old stuff. Put some comments into my Facebook thing, and trust me, I won't be offended if you put a correction in there. If I've misread something, just put it clearly enough so that we know what the word is and then what the correct rendering is from Old English to Modern English, okay? Or if there's something you disagree with, put it down there. And hey, I'm open to all different kinds of ideas. The Ahad has a motto, unity in diversity, not diversity in conflict. And our chief goal is to provide a loving, safe environment for people to come and worship the Master, Yeshua Messiah, and honor his death, burial, and resurrection. But most importantly, looking forward to the day when he returns and restores this earth to its pristine state. And so what a glorious day that will be. Okay, my friends, so until next time, I will see you later.